Hello and welcome to the Delivering Innovation podcast from Perspectiv, in collaboration with the Centre for Creativity in Professional Practice at the Business School of City, University of London, formerly known as CAS. We look at what it takes to create value from innovation through conversations with people working in a range of roles and sectors to make innovation and change happen. The aim is to share ideas that you can rely on to become more effective. I'm Ian Stromsmoe. In this episode, Andy Wilkins and I spoke with Shai Vyakarnam, known as Shai, who's an educator, mentor and connector in entrepreneurship, as well as being an entrepreneur and business angel himself. The focus of Shai's work is on enabling science and technology businesses to unlock value in their ideas and turn them into successful innovations. He pioneered courses for entrepreneurship at a number of universities, including Cambridge, Reading and Cranfield, as well as establishing entrepreneurship centres at Nottingham Business School and Cambridge Judge Business School. Shai is co-author of the books Camels, Tigers and Unicorns and the Scale Up Manual, which describes the Triple Chasm model and provides a unified approach to managing the creation and commercialisation of innovative products and services. We kicked off talking about the opportunity to address climate change through innovation.
People like Greta Thunberg, she inspired 7 million young people to think differently about climate.
Then we discussed the importance of articulating the need that an innovation addresses in the right language to the right customer, with examples from the dairy industry.
A bovine TB detector using quantum physics. Wow!
Now let's meet Shai. Hello, Andy.
Morning, Ian.
And welcome to today's guest, Shai Vyakarnam. Thank you very much for joining us, Shai.
Welcome, Ian. Nice to be here and to be back with Andy again.
Shai, to get things going, we'd love you to give a brief introduction about your background and what you do as it relates to delivering innovation.
Sure. The 2-minute version would be that when I finished my PhD in 1986, which was on the social relevance of management education, I had a concluding paragraph that said if business schools were to take their role in society seriously, that they should get into entrepreneurship education in much more proactive ways than they were in 1980s, late 80s. I hadn't realized, but that kind of wrote a job description for myself. And so since then, I have been involved in education, the higher education sector in the universities, teaching, mentoring, and so on in the world of entrepreneurship and innovation. I suppose the satisfaction I take from a particular part of my work is that I began to pioneer what I would describe as education for entrepreneurship, rather distinct from about. So business schools are teaching lots of case studies and telling you stories about how other people did it, but very rarely were they addressing the inner entrepreneur of the students themselves. So that's taken me into the world of new venture creation, early stage growth, etc. And therefore, to policymakers, to large corporates, to new startups, to mid-sized companies, all of whom are thinking about how do I do this? So that's the shortest non-Californian way of introducing myself.
Great. And our audience will love that background. They'll be hanging on every word you say. Well, thank you very much for that. Now it's over to Andy.
Good morning, Shai. Thank you very much for being here with us again and lovely to see you. So here we go, that big question that we start everybody with. What does delivering innovation, turning ideas into value mean to you?
Well, primarily, it's about delivering on some kind of impact in society. Now, in the early days, it was all about kind of self-employment because I was in the post-Thatcher era when society was on its knees. But I would say increasingly with the influence of things like the UN Sustainable Development Goals taking off and society beginning to learn that self-reliance doesn't involve selfishness and that it's possible to do good and make money, do well by doing good. That's a kind of a philosophical thing. So for me, innovation would be around that sort of thinking and mindset that society has got so many issues. I mean, there are 17 so-called SDGs. Wouldn't want to touch on all of them. But let's just take poverty, health, climate, And can we not innovate our way out of those things, those crises? So it gives me a sense of meaning and purpose, I suppose. And innovation for me is a route towards that.
Thank you. We'll pick up on some of those dimensions as we go through this. Can you say a little bit more about this idea of the philosophy that you talked about behind your response, that innovation, entrepreneurship doesn't have to be selfish? Because there's a lot of people have that sense. I was curious, what's behind that? What's on your mind?
I suppose what's going on now is this notion of the sort of the zero-sum game, that if for me to win, you have to lose kind of approach to life that we see from the dominant players in this and the so-called role models we all look up to. And we see how they're overtaking our lives, not least in social media terms, and the impact that's having. And I think that the noise level that comes from a tiny fragment of society that's either based out of these venture capital driven companies and the big conglomerates, and how they're trying to dominate things. We've seen from the work of Piketty, the French economist, who's showing us the income disparities that have grown. We've seen evidence from people like Greta Thunberg, whatever you think about her media approach. She inspired 7 million young people to think differently about climate. Now, if the so-called the famous or infamous 0.5% and 1% of them actually start to take action, that young woman would have made a difference, right? Why was this? Because we're understanding that just making money only for ourselves at the cost of somebody else isn't sufficient. I know we still struggle with that, with the world of innovation, because we're still drowning the world in plastics. We're still drowning the world in slave labor kind of approach to labor content. But there's a growing feeling, I think, amongst the younger people that can't be right longer term. But the model of the Friedmanite approach to capitalism, which from the mid to late 70s, which said something along the lines that the role of the manager is to maximize profits for the shareholder, right? That has become such a powerful mantra, should I say it, American mantra, in the context of the way the world goes. It's actually created these huge disparities. They talk about communism having failed. I think capitalism has failed us as well to some extent, right? Because his work in the 1977, I think, was Freedom and Capitalism, his book. So the counterpush to that, Edith Penrose's work in the 50s, Theory of the Growth of the Firm, she said the role of the manager is to deploy scarce resources to the best opportunities available. That's so different, isn't it, from saying the role of the manager is to maximize profits. It sets up a completely different ethos. And I think a lot of the German companies, the Mittelstand companies, those mid-sized companies in Germany have pursued Edith Penrose's philosophy, which is we make a bloody good product that people want to buy and helps them in their lives, whether it's kitchen towels or fridges or washing machines or cars or whatever it is. And we make a living from that. Distinct from saying, I want to maximize the return for my investors, which means you don't really care what you do. And so we have, in effect, somewhat pointless activities like Twitter and Facebook, right? We all use it. Of course we use it because it's come into our lives. But really, do we need that stuff? We pack everything in plastics. So we're destroying our planet in the interest of capitalism. I'm sorry I'm gone off at this sort of hugely philosophical left-wing, right-wing diatribe when we're trying to talk about innovation, the mechanisms and so on. But I think it's really important to think of why we're doing this stuff. And there's a wonderful little video clip by a gentleman called Sam Petroda, who says, for whom do we innovate? If you YouTube him or his talks in Silicon Valley and so on, it says, are we innovating the next Rolex watch? Or are we innovating to solve the problem of poverty? To what end are we innovating? So I think it's a really good question as well. Not just how do we innovate, but why are we innovating and for whom?
And the thing that drives us is the ability for us as a race to use creativity faster than we're screwing up the planet is probably the only thing that will save us. We can join you in that kind of big space philosophy conversation, although I'm going to nudge us back to earth. For those who have not yet had a chance to read about the Triple Chasm, which I know particularly is covered in the Scale Up Manual and is one of our texts, particularly
nice to hear,
on the Masters in Innovation, Creativity and Leadership. The other book that we refer to is mentioned, of course, Camels, Tigers and Unicorns. But I was wondering if you could say a few words about the book Camels, Unicorns and Tigers, which you wrote with your friend and colleague Uday, and then maybe move on to the Scale Up Manual and the Triple Chasm model, if that's possible.
Absolutely. So the title of the book, Camels, Tigers, Unicorns, frankly speaking, came out of a casual chat over a dinner. And then it sounded like a great title for a book. And it stuck. And I guess the metaphors would be that the camel gets ready with all its resources, has a plan to cross the desert, if you will, and then is able to make the journey. It's got enough fuel and water in its tanks, if you will, to make the long haul across the desert. The tiger, on the other hand, is one that's agile and leaping about, almost consuming as much resource, but is able to just about have enough energy to go hunting again and again. So this would be, if you like, the venture capital backed firms in our world that are going from one round of funding to the next, always with hunger in his eyes, right? And attack in his limbs. And the unicorn, for us, is just this mythical creature, which is, excuse my foreign language, a load of BS that comes through from the world of Silicon Valley and so forth, right? And it's basically, again, the mechanism of greed, which is that if I give a sufficiently crazy idea out there and sell it to enough people, they will buy into it, and I can then make a huge profit by creating a valuation of $1 billion or more with pointless products or pointless activities, right? WeWork and all sorts of other things come to mind with that. Companies that are worth $1 billion or more that have taken 10, 15 years by making things that people want to buy are not the typical unicorn things, right? They have league tables for a mythical creature called the unicorn. It says, how much can I rip society off better than anybody else? So I just think it's bonkers. So it's a painful joke. But the idea is really about, what philosophical route do we take? So we got stuck with that title. What sits behind the book Camels, Tigers, Unicorns actually is more interesting, which is that we looked at the innovation literature, particularly the adoption curves of Everett Rogers, and looked at his inflection points of the innovator, early adopter, early and late majorities, and so on. People would be familiar with that curve. Really influential piece of work of the late 50s, early 60s. Followed up later by Geoffrey Moore in his book Crossing the Chasm. I think it's early 90s that he came out with that idea. They were both kind of right. Interestingly, Everett Rogers did not have data, but he had a wonderful hypothesis about the way that innovation is adopted in the marketplace. And his concept, of course, is about diffusion. Diffusion for him is the communication channels and the diffusing of the idea. So more and more people adopt it. And these inflection points that Everett Rogers had in his original work were based on standard deviations because he had nowhere else to go with that. And I think it's a real piece of genius, actually, to think about it on those terms. The problem is, without the data to back it up, the timelines that associate themselves with the x-axis of adoption are misleading. So conceptually, yes, you have the early adoption maybe of bread from 10,000 years ago through to, it gets normalized by the 20th century. And now we have all sorts of other varieties, but we'll never quite go off to zero, right? We'll never quite give up bread. So what's the timeline for bread on the one hand? Maybe, 100,000 more years. What's that for a fancy digital watch thing? It could be months or years. So x-axis had not been normalized and timetabled. So we thought we'd do that. We added this idea of normalizing it to 1, so that sector by sector, we could say, how long does it take on average for things to reach this level of maturity? It's a complicated concept because it's qualitative as well as quantitative. The y-axis, on the other hand, which is to do with sales and customer acquisition, I think in the modern world, the y-axis becomes sales, dollar signs, right? And that kind of doesn't tell us the full story. Whereas if we change the dollar sign to the number of customers that are out in the market that you need to reach, and let's say there are 1,000 customers that ideally make up your saturation point, and that's normalized to 1, then you can measure your progress against 1 over a timeline. That would be the first contribution I think we make in Camels, Tigers, Unicorns. As a result of doing the data analysis from some 300 companies, or a much wider database that we originally approached, we found that there were those three chasms, exactly as Fred Rogers had predicted in his amazing work, but we found they fell in different ways and different places. The first chasm, we use Geoffrey Moore's language now, to describe the inflection points, was when you finally reached the point you had a product or a service that you could test with customers. And if you can't get to that point, you've got nowhere in the market to go. So you need to show that your product or technology or innovation works not just on your kitchen table or in the laboratory of your companies, but actually is something that you can show to a customer, and the customer uses it and says, hey, this does work. But instead of it being left pointing, it should be right pointing, or it should go up and down rather than left and right, or whatever else. Get some feedback, and you've crossed your first chasm by engaging with the customer. Your innovation has now taken on a shape that is being driven by the customer's voice, if you like. So design thinking boys do this stuff a lot, right? So they help to cross this chasm with that approach. Once you've got the sort of product out there in the marketplace or technology out there, you've got your what we would call prototype customers, shortened to proto customers, which are the equivalent of your early adopters. You then are moving through, and maybe you're making some sales now, getting some revenues in. You've gone beyond your first 2 or 3 customers who may or may not pay you, now into people that are willing to pay you for this stuff. You get into the next inflection point, which is where you have to try and create a full-blooded business, right? And there's a second chasm where you're trying to figure out how you scale volume, manufacturing, service levels, synthesis of the various components. You're trying to build a full team. You're doing market research. You're redefining your customer base, maybe redefining your value propositions at this point. You've got a much clearer idea of how the markets work and value spaces work and so forth. Your IP is being clarified. Your funding is getting rock solid. In other words, you're becoming a grown-up business. That's a very, very difficult chasm to cross. That's the so-called death valley, or valley of death, that people talk about in the innovation journey. And that timing can be very different. And it's the third chasm, that you get to the third chasm. Now your product is working, your technology is working, you've got customers, you've got plenty of reputation building up in the marketplace, and now you have to press the gas pedal. Now you're hiring salespeople, you're changing the culture of the business from the sort of innovative R&D oriented thing to a kind of grown-up, scale-up type business. So the first chasm is driven by prototype customers, proto customers. The second one would be so-called charter customers. And the third group would be your mainstream customers. Now, in the world of Geoffrey Moore and his Crossing the Chasm book, what we describe as a charter customer would be his beachhead customers. But his beachhead customers are reflective of mainstream. And that's right. But he's missed a whole chasm in his work. He's got only the third chasm. Our third chasm is his main chasm. So he's said we get past the first and the second. It's not of interest to him. He's interested in the mainstream. So his book is very powerful for when you've got past the third chasm, or to get past the third chasm. So that's kind of broadly it. Camels, Tigers, Unicorn, I have to admit, as a book, is not for the faint-hearted. The scale-up manual picks up on the themes of that and takes it forward into much more a how-to, can-do approach with more tools and things. And now my co-author in particular is driving the commercialization of that. We've set up a company called the Triple Chasm Company, and he and a guy called Sam Dodds are now directors of that. And we're trying to ourselves form a business into how we can use that basic thinking in the way that maybe Strategizer used the business model Canvas and various others. But we think we have a much more holistic approach to helping innovation journeys, especially from early stages. So even mature companies that have got new innovations coming through can probably use our approach of crossing chasms, but the vectors, the 12 vectors that they need to understand fully, and how we can quantify those elements and go with them. So that's where we are on that. Very exciting journey for ourselves, actually, applying, like the carpenter, his own tools, trying to figure this out on our own journey as well.
The way I think I'd heard that summarized, possibly by yourself, Shai, was that Chasm 1 is effectively product engineering, Chasm 2 is market engineering, and Chasm 3 is to do with business engineering, as a kind of engineering way to summarize the three chasms. I think I heard that from you, but I may have made it up.
Both are fine. I think that product engineering is the beginning, but in the context of meeting the needs of a customer, not just yet again the Heath Robinson, I'm in a shed, I'm going to polish my product in isolation. No, this is very much about collaborating with other people to say, hey, does anybody actually need this thing, right?
We're absolutely with you on that. The critical path to innovation that we share with people, it's not a linear sequence, but it's kind of easier to understand it this way. But it goes need, idea, solution, diffusion, and then the last one is valorization to get value from it. So, yeah, absolutely. Without any need, it could be a vanity project, right?
So Andy, this is a really interesting thing about what my co-author, my colleague and friend Uday described as impedance matching. So the electrical engineers amongst in the audience will understand about how impedance needs to match. And here what it is that we'll call it product to keep it simple, right? Rather product, service, So does the product meet the needs of the customer? Okay, which customer, right? So we have this invention, or we've discovered something, or we've created something, and it's fabulous, and we're very excited about it. Where are the customers that need it? And they do need it, but how do we find them? There's 7 billion people on this planet, and the first 100 that you speak to say, "No, we don't need this stuff," because they're all a bit boring. And I go, no, nobody needs this stuff. Actually, you go to Nigeria and say, "Oh my God, where have you been?" Right? Or you go to rural India and say, "This is exactly what we're looking for. Why has this not come to us?" So people get sniffy, for example, with affordable medical devices going, "Yeah, there's no profit in that." Sure, buddy, there's no profit in that if you're only selling to US insurance companies, right? But if you're trying to meet the needs of 500 million people without healthcare, there's a little bit of a need over there, and you might make a few bob. We very much encourage also entrepreneurs to get into the so-called helicopter and take a look at the world from slightly higher up. So we've developed this concept of market spaces. We went back to the guru of value chains, Michael Porter's work, where it talks about the value chain from R&D through to production, through to whatever, until it reaches the customers and all the infrastructure required. That's inside the business, right? I think the genius of the thinking that Uday brought to it was say, hang on a minute, if we flip this to the outside, what does it look like? What does that value chain look like in the big wide world? So a quick example of that might be, for instance, well, let's just take milk, right? The value chain of milk is you've got a herd of cattle somewhere on a farm eating some grass. So the grass has to be grown. That requires maybe fertilizers, certainly needs rain and water. So you've got those elements of activity going on. The cow itself needs to be kept in good health and kept free from disease and so on. Then the poor thing is then sent into some machine-driven unit to draw the milk from it, which is all then shoved into a container full on the back of a truck, taken off to pasteurization process, where all the fat and all the sludge is removed, because Daisy's and Maisie's milk have different components because they ate in different parts of the same field. And then all of that's purified, cleaned, and heated and cooled and what have you. Then eventually it's bottled and canned and plasticed and stuff like that. It's also sent off for making ice cream and cream and butters and cheeses and all the rest of it. And then we go off and buy it in supermarkets or have it delivered to our doorsteps, if we're lucky, in glass bottles. So there's an entire chain of activity. And in the pasteurization, you've got valves and buttons and thermostats and boilers and fire and heat and cool and drain pipes and stuff like that to get rid of the sludge. By the way, speaking of sludge, all of that goes into our rivers unclean. So we're also polluting ourselves while we're drinking milk. So there's another cost to the dairy industry to us beyond all the other stuff that we talk about. So that's the outside world of the farmer of the milk sector. So our invention, which might be a valve to prevent the sludge coming back into the milk under pressure or whatever it is, that's our little piece. Where do we fit in? We don't fit into the R&D we make and sell and do and service and our internal approach to life. But where do we fit into the world of the dairy industry? Where we fit into maybe 100 pasteurization units that operate a certain type of equipment that need our type of valve to stop polluting rivers. So that's kind of understanding the need of the customer. Who is the customer? It would be the risk assessment manager, whatever, the Fred with his spanner, inside, and they're the people we need to speak to. So this idea of impedance matching what we have on offer with what the customer needs, finding that is a massively creative task, and lots of detailed homework needs to be done.
There's a saying which is innovation happens where customer need meets supplier expertise. The first diffusion or innovation, in a sense, is finding who is that customer.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there are organizations who figure out and do that work.
Yeah, and for me, in order to find the customer, the right customer, is to step into that helicopter, go up 5,000 feet and look at the market and how it operates, because underneath that, you also have regulatory issues. You would have maybe technology driving issues and market drivers. So if you take this valve and talk to a typical farmer, I can make your milk better. Yeah, he doesn't care. I remember trying to advise a young student who had a bovine TB detector using quantum physics. Wow. So I talked to a farmer friend of mine. I said, don't talk to me about it, talk to my vet, because it's his job to keep my cattle healthy. This is why I think that Chasm 1 crossing can be really important, because engaging with potential customers and users to validate the actual relevance of the product. I'm delighted to be non-exec director of a company called Corrosion Radar. It's exactly how we started. We started the company, I say we grandly because I'm on the board now, but the innovators started the company by first building a little prototype that could detect moisture and corrosion, and then putting a desktop demo and showing it in the oil industry. And somebody in the oil industry said, come and talk to us about this because we have a problem on our site in Belgium, and gave him the first purchase order for a trial product, on the back of which now, we've happily raised money from Saudi Aramco and all sorts, and we're a team of 12, 15 people now, and growing strongly to resolve corrosion under insulation. That's a great team. That's also part of the Chasm 2 stuff, but it started off by validating the relevance of that in a particular segment, having identified the problem.
Does the Triple Chasm model apply to digital? I partly asked that because of Itamar Rosen and Emmanuel Simonson's work, Absolute Value, which came post Geoffrey Moore, who found that Geoffrey Moore's stuff was indeed needs to be brought up to date because of the digital world.
Yes.
So I was curious, does the Triple Chasm model apply equally to digital and physical products?
I'm currently mentoring a company that's very early days, but two very smart computer scientists who are using AI and natural language programming. Over the last 3 years, they've built up a massive library that will enable us to look at emotional content. So where, for example, you have Grammarly and spell checking stuff as plugins to Word and what have you, we're now looking at the possibility of looking at the emotional nature. So are you creating a happy feeling or a sad feeling or an aggressive? What's the tone of what's going out? So the marketing folks across the world would want to use this to be able to project nice upbeat language, and sometimes the wordsmiths would struggle with that. So we have that possibility. So if I look at where they are now in their journey, and just use that as an example, it's a breakthrough. It's a next level up from spelling and grammar is to look at this, is that we need the first customer to show that it works. We have to cross Chasm 1. You imagine in digital, how do you get adoption, or flip it around the other way, diffusion of a message that we have something new to do with emotional content and understanding of that, if you can't demonstrate its efficacy, right? So Chasm 1 is right there staring us in the face, and we're trying to find a route to a company that says, give it a shot over here, not the rule makers, but the rule breakers inside a company that says, give it a shot. The way that these guys are going to approach it is to build a plugin, get it on WordPress or Google or something, just to get user interest. And that might then give us a breakthrough to the B2B market, which is really where we need to be. So that example is just telling you how we plan to cross Chasm 1. I'm kind of interested to get them to Chasm 2 stage, which is how do you build the team that will turn you from a project idea, which has great scope, into a business that will make a big difference. So I think the journey for any tech-driven company, Andy, I think it does follow the Rogers' kind of adoption thing. But in terms of Triple Chasm, I think that the steps that we need to take to break through into the first customer, creating a viable business for the longer term, and then building up the foundations in such a way that you can actually go global with it. I think those steps arise. I think if one is self-employed, working from home type consultancy business, I think the first chasm still applies, finding that first customer. Probably chasm 2 is not such a big deal because you're not trying to build a team of people and so on. One is being self-employed. So it's just finding more and more and more customers. So just going between chasm 1, chasm 2, if you will, until it's time to retire to Antibes or wherever it is one is supposedly mythically meant to retire to.
Yeah, the idea, I guess, with consultants is often you're joining teams within your clients to help them normally diffuse something. Thank you for the answer. Great explanation. There's a famous equation that we use. You've probably come across from one of my old colleagues, Ruth Noller. She was a Euclidean mathematician. She came up with a formula for creativity, which is C equals a function of A, attitude, open brackets, knowledge, comma, imagination, comma, and evaluation. And I love the idea that what you're doing with that app that you're talking about, you're going after the emotional aspects, back to the notion almost of the head and the heart, because typically knowledge, or K, is information and data. But the idea you're going to try and unpack and get after the emotional tone inside it as well. A really interesting idea.
In the second half, Andy suggests a new name for Shai's book.
Yeah, maybe it needs to be camels, tigers, unicorns, and turkeys. So,
Shai highlights the need for entrepreneurs to engage both their head and their heart.
And the best entrepreneurs that I saw were those that could engage both the amygdala and the frontal lobe in their process.
Let's get back to it.
What's the problem? The problem is in Riga, in Latvia, in one waste collection center, is 5,000 tons of unremediated plastic per month as mixed waste. What are we going to do about that? That's just a tiny example globally. And plastics are entering our food chain through microplastics in fish and things. I mean, we really have a massive problem with that. So my technical engineering friend talks about hydrothermal liquefaction under 2 hot, doesn't make any sense to anybody. Nobody can adopt that. But if he said, for instance, we can get rid of this plastic mountain, because at the moment what happens with this plastic is either goes into landfill or gets incinerated for so-called energy from waste. Means we put toxic air into our atmosphere and CO2 and so on. But here's a mechanism which can get rid of the same plastic that we have without damaging the planet. That kind of starts to make sense. And oh, by the way, for the waste industry that spends maybe 100 euros per ton to get rid of this stuff in landfill or burn it or whatever, we can now do this for, say, 30 euros per ton. There's so-called value proposition. So the sales guys have to figure out how to re-message what the engineers have to say in language that makes sense to the users and the buyers, the customers, the people with the budgets. And if they're not able to make that translational link, and they just say, let's just put out HTL, on the website and show some pictures of this machinery, people will buy from us. Well, that's the wrong approach. But if they're able to understand how to message it, the value proposition is such a critical part. But then again, you need to understand who in the value chain, for example, of plastic remediation, would give a damn about your product. And while he was trying in the UK, and he's still trying in the UK, it ain't going to work because there are 40 incineration sites in the UK with capacities to burn huge amounts of plastic. They make their money by selling electricity. It is not in their interest to stop plastics coming to them. So they're going to pay the waste disposal industries enough money that it's cheaper for the waste disposal industries to continue to send plastics to these incineration sites. And we come out and say, oh, actually, don't produce electricity and make money with that. We will instead pressure cook it and turn it into a biocrude, which can then be refined into nice new products to send somewhere else. Turkeys don't vote for Christmas, right? So the industry is going to stop you from getting access to the waste So the UK is tied up for the next 10, 20 years in continuing to defeat the CO2 objectives that are being set by having technology that was adopted 10, 15 years ago. The Baltics, on the other hand, and other parts of the world do not yet have those constraints. I think Lithuania does have incinerators. The European Union, of which Britain is no longer a part, has got regulations coming in that this will not be allowed by 2030. So that's where the market is. So whose need do you meet? You go over to the European Union, you abandon the UK, and I have now helped to start a company in Latvia. I'm now a shareholder of a Latvian company. And if you think camels, tigers, unicorns going to a pub is a joke, you wait till you hear the one about the Russian, the Latvian, the Indian, and the Iranian turning up in a pub. And so you go where the problems are and you solve those problems.
You sound, Shai, like you're again into another area of Roger's work where he talks about the decision-making process. You've got these options of collective, authoritarian, or discretionary. And what you're describing there is we need the government in places to nudge and restructure, to enable certain technologies to come through and break the commercial model that exists in that sector already. Because, as you say, turkeys don't vote for Christmas. Yeah, maybe it needs to be camels, tigers, unicorns, and turkeys. So,
yeah, I think the other thing is that the UK, for all that we might want to criticize, were the first to adopt railways, right? And the first to adopt plastic incineration. And as a result of it, its railways now getting old and doddery. And maybe the plastics industry, maybe 20 years ago, it seemed like such a good idea to burn this stuff up, produce electricity from it. Being an early adopter, if you will, now we've discovered the technology is actually false. But there we have it. We have what we have over there. And now it's going to take another 10, 20 years to unlock ourselves from that to more efficacious technologies.
You famously once said to me, I think, Shai, you cannot go faster than the market.
Yeah, I think it's probably right. If I said that, it sounds really deep and meaningful. And but if I didn't say that, I would generally agree with that sentiment.
Yeah, sorry if I've put words in your mouth. I got it written down in one of my journals from when one of the talks I've heard you.
Oh, right. Well, excellent. I will take full credit for that then.
I just got this sense, some of the plastic business you were talking about, is it ahead of the curve? Is it ahead of the market? If you can get the government to say, do this rather than burn it, then that would clearly help. Otherwise, I wonder, are you ahead of the market?
No, I see this idea of HTL, hydrothermal liquefaction or pressure cooking. It's been around for a long time. You know, in our homes, we produce soup from aging vegetables, right? We chuck the stuff in, put a bit of water in it, and turn up the temperature. And hey, presto, we have some soup. So that's not new. And we put any old vegetable in there and, 4 or 5 of them and whatever. The same thing applies to HTL as a bigger process. That's organic waste, if you will. So absolutely nothing new in that. But what is interesting is that it has not been developed at an industrial scale on a continuous flow basis to get rid of food waste. Now, if you then put stuff in that has come from crude oil, you've kind of got something that can go back to that same state. That's the theory. Now it needs to be proven. So we need to get past the lab stage. We need to get to that chasm 1. And for all the talk in the market, Andy, nobody's willing to fund that experiment for a lone entrepreneur working from a shed. They might fund Imperial College or somewhere like that, right? So it might also be who's doing it rather than what's being said. But then they try to build a system that is of scale, that can deal with the millions of tons. Then you're talking about tens of millions of pounds worth of investment. And if you're trying to operate under something called 200 bar of pressure, you're basically building an explosive instrument there. And so there are all sorts of health and safety and other. So it's a systems design thinking. It requires a really big consortium of companies coming together. So we need to solve this problem. So you've got this lone voice that goes on about HTL without making the translational work. And if you like, my voice is now helping him. So I might be the flim-flam marketing guy that he's got hold of, that is rephrasing what he's got. In fact, one of your students, Andy, she very kindly introduced me to her colleague in their company in Portugal. We talked about this idea of remediating poultry manure in their Angolan farm. Couldn't go anywhere because my dear friend just talked about valves and thermoplastics and heat and sun and so on, but not the system that would solve their problem of getting rid of 5 tons of chicken shit per day. So the language didn't work. So that translational piece is not just the engineering, but it's the language of value proposition.
There's a social shift that often has to happen. The technical piece is actually, inverted commas, be playful here, is easy. Getting people to change behaviors, be it finance, the finance system, to change that system to be a fairer system. We could go off and have another hour's conversation now, all about how fair and are people really taking risks when the VCs are talking about certain things. But that's part of the social system and the infrastructure that supports all of this. And it just takes a huge amount of time, doesn't it, for us people to catch up with what the technology can do sometimes.
Yeah, we have to have the imagination to work out what this could mean. But you have this idea of the amygdala and the frontal lobe as well, which is, the deep imagination side and the rational side, that have to work together to say, wow, that's exciting. What can I do with it? Now, plastic remediation doesn't excite everybody, right? A nice new shiny Rolex watch might excite people. For me, this idea of solving a big problem out there means that my radar is switched on to technologies that could work with that. And because I've been working with entrepreneurs for, 30 years or so now, and especially in my 14 years at Cambridge with some people with 2 brains coming up with ideas that could resolve problems, my mind is always working. And this is where I think mentors are needed, where we're working on 2 levels all the time. The what if question. How do I join these dots together? Who should I talk to sort this out? So you've got a photonics chip thing coming out of Bristol, which could do with ocular CT, like a CT scanner, but for eyes. I think, okay, this is interesting. Where could this go? What's the cost of this? Who knows about this stuff? Oh, it so happens I know the founders of Cambridge Silicon Radio who did the chip for Bluetooth. So first thing I'm going to try and do is to put them in touch with Phil and Glenn and have a chat, Another guy called Steve Barlow, who was another guy who did another type of chip, which was to do with video chips in phones, sold to Qualcomm. Who do I know that can actually help these guys to figure out whether they've actually got something or not? First of all, validate the technology. And secondly, how could they go to market with this? Which fabs should they engage with? So who has the channel knowledge of the marketplace that they should talk to? So that kind of stuff, that joining the dots and being optimistic about stuff in the first place, rather than saying, nah, it did not work. Nobody wants this stuff.
My final question is, if you reflect back over the years and had a pile of the projects that you would say, yeah, they were fabulous, achieved the need, expectations met, and then you had another pile of projects where they'd fizzled out. Things didn't meet expectations. They were underachievers. What would it be that explained the difference between the first pile and the second pile?
I think the people, the teams that came together that achieved hugely, I think were driven by passion and purpose. They were very clear, and they combined this ability to envisage something and to convert that vision into operational detail. And they had that capacity. Maybe the leader, the team are able to articulate something that's really quite fantastic. They might have the social skills to bring people on side. The families, the friends, the customers, the suppliers, people understood it. They got it. They understood what was going on. They probably had the range of maturity of knowledge and skill sets available to them. And probably most importantly, they had the ethical values that meant that they did what they say they would do. All team members contributing equally, passionately to make the thing a success. And they had the level of integrity that spoke to the world. And those would be where it really worked. Where it all goes pear-shaped, if you will, is where the ego of members of the team just simply overtook the vision and the values, and or that they behaved really badly towards each other, disrespectfully. You were probably expecting me to say the market, there was no need for it, or the product failed, or ran out of money and cash. Yeah, all of that. But if you ask me what really in my heart of hearts and my head tells me about what worked, what didn't work, what worked was where the team had all these values that I talked about. So that would be my summary perspective, Andy, on that.
I feel like Andy may have ceded that answer to you because it's absolutely perfect for Andy's other calls on the Michael.
Yeah, I don't know what you're thinking about there, Ian. But I'm going to summarize. So what I got was clear vision as a team, social skills to bring people along. Clearly, you've got to be competent and have the knowledge. But also, I love the idea that there was an ethical tone to what was going on about it as well. And on the dark side, that basically its ego kind of gets in the way of the vision, of collaborating with others, or just sort of doing the right thing, kind of making it for maybe short-term personal gain, rather than something a bit more collective. Thank you, Shai. I think I hopefully summarized that accurately. It was great to hear.
Okay, Shai, we always end with 3 standard questions designed to reveal a bit more about you personally. If you could please give an answer and then briefly describe the reasoning for your answer.
Sure.
Okay, so the first question is follow the rules or break the rules?
Mostly break the rules. And the reason for that is in entrepreneurship, if you have to seek permission to do everything, you don't do anything that actually frees your own spirit. Whereas if you're mostly trying to break the rules and you're seeking forgiveness, you're probably pushing your own personal boundaries further and further along. And I would say that applies to businesses as well, within context of risk and so on.
Breaking the rules pushes your own personal spirit and boundaries.
Yes, I think so. I think that's what it does. If you're just purely conforming to rules all the time, then you're doing other people's bidding. They have thought about the life and the world around them, and they expect you to do what they're doing and what they think is right for you. But that means that your soul, your spirit, your inner self has got nowhere to go with that. Whereas if you're trying to break the rules, obviously not rules that are there to safeguard society overall, don't limit yourself, I think, is what I would mean by breaking the rules.
I love that. It's a very freeing idea, liberating.
Thank you.
So the second question is talk it through with others or think it through on your own?
Oh, always talk it through with others. There's always a collective intelligence that's around. If you're afraid of talking about your idea with other people, it says to me that you're trying to be a bit of a perfectionist and you're polishing your idea to the extent that it might be so well polished and developed that actually you've reached a point where nobody wants it. And you might be polishing the wrong product or the wrong idea, right? Whereas if you talk it through with other people and you're getting feedback and you're able to synthesize and analyze and reason with it, you build a better product. So there's a learning loop involved in talking to other people. And as you do, you also build a collective momentum for your idea. And the people understand what you're doing. And it's remarkable how other people's contributions can grow your idea much more fully. Yeah, I think that's the only way forward. I've been talking endlessly about a particular idea. And because I've been talking it through with people, I've now helped to create a team. And that sort of movement forward has come entirely by talking to people.
Great. So talking it through builds momentum for the idea.
As well as make sure you don't have the wrong idea, you know.
Okay. So last question, trust your head or follow your heart?
Ooh. There has to be a balance. There has to be a yin and a yang on this one. I think you have to follow your heart to feel a fulfilling life. But I would say that if you don't have the frontal lobe activated, it might be that you end up backing the wrong horse or gambling or doing stupid things because your heart is leading you in different ways. So, of course, you have to try and satisfy the needs of the heart, but your mind has to be engaged. I'm sorry to be a bit academic over this, but 2008, I was very fortunate to publish a paper with Barbara Sahakian, who's a psychiatrist over at Cambridge. And our topic was about the innovative brain. And I learned from that there are 2 parts of the brain. There's the amygdala, which is deeply buried inside, and the cortex. and is the one that deals with intuition and instinct and so forth, fight or flight and so on. And there's the frontal lobe, which deals with rational thinking and behavior. And the best entrepreneurs that I saw, because we did a piece of research together, were those that could engage both the amygdala and the frontal lobe in their process. Whereas the compulsive gamblers that she had in her other study only engaged the amygdala, only engaged the heart. And the slightly boring people who did nothing innovative at all only used their frontal lobe.
Brilliant. So it's scientifically proven to be more entrepreneurial.
I would like to take some, satisfaction in that understanding that it was done with somebody. But basically, think about the hot part of the brains and the cold part of the brain as you think about it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for those answers. It's been very enlightening.
My pleasure.
So that's it. Shai, I'm only going to say, just by the way, you mentioned a while ago that you were about to use the BS word, and you kind of withdrew yourself and held back, which was great. I would just point out that BS also means benign structures. There's a nut. So just for all of the listeners who were wondering what Shai was about to say, it was the word benign structures. Definitely. As opposed to any other imaginary thoughts you might have had.
Absolutely.
But Shai, thank you hugely for all your thoughts today, and I've really enjoyed the conversation with you.
I've enjoyed every minute of it as well. Thank you, Ian and Andy. It's been great fun.
Thank you very much for joining us, Shai. It's been fantastic. This podcast was brought to you by Perspectiv in collaboration with the Centre for Creativity in Professional Practice at the Business School of City, University of London. You can follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn, or visit us at perspectiv.co.uk, Perspective without an E. If you liked this podcast, please like and subscribe. Thank you for listening, and please join us again.